you, Lee Lowenfish, and thank you for coming back to Chautauqua, and thank you for getting to meet Mark Altschiller, which ultimately led you here to Chautauqua, and then a few years ago here at the Jackson Center to talk about Branch Rickey. And now we got this amazing book which has been well received, Baseball's Endangered Species, Inside the Craft of Scouting. So thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here. I mean, this is that famous quote of Jacques Barson that people quote a lot about to understand the heart and mind of baseball, of America, you need to understand baseball. And what people don't usually quote after is that, especially in the small towns and the school ball. And so when I came here, there's almost an annual week that I spend at Chautauqua doing variations on baseball and American culture. And they had the softball game with the tarp skunks coming to play the softball players in Chautauqua. And the forecast looked dreary, and I didn't see how the game could get in. All of a sudden the skies open with light and a little sun, and to see the little kids playing the game with the adults, I mean, that just it warmed my heart, because for all the problems in the country, and even with the management of baseball, which has gone on for over 100 years, as you know from my books and your experience, to see the kids loving the game and knowing that there's something so deep in the heart of this country about you. And I mean, I grew up with a father who loved to play ball before I was born, but he had umpires as patients, and that's sort of where he was a dermatologist, and that's where my love came from. I mean, one of my father's patients was Babe Pinelli.
Okay.
And so, and he actually came to the house occasionally, and my mother would say, "It's his day off, don't talk about baseball." Well, how could I resist, you know? And he told stories about, he survived the earthquake of San Francisco as a boy, and became the breadwinner of the family, and became one of the first Italian-American ball players for the Reds, and then he became a big umpire. His last game was Don Larson's perfect game behind home plate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was his last game behind home plate, and then he became a supervisor. And he was a great guy to be around. He might have done some amateur boxing like his contemporary Tony Lazzeri, but he made baseball his life. And so when you're around people like that, I mean, he would bring balls, autographed baseballs, and my hero was Alvin Dark, the shortstop for the Giants, and my sister's hero was Robin Roberts, pitcher for the Phillies. And I'll never forget this. I mean, both balls are long gone, but they were autographed to the wrong person. I mean, I got the ball that was written from Robin Roberts. I'm really sorry that one was lost, because I got to know Roberts when I was doing my first book, and he's the man who basically was the force that brought Marvin Miller into baseball. And then at the end of his life, he really, in one of his books, had to put into writing that the players had gotten out of hand. You know, the owners have always been out of hand, but you know, the players had lost the bond with the public. And the thing is, though, those bonds can get ruptured, but as long as we see kids playing this game and love what it's all about, I mean, that's what keeps me going and keeps me writing a lot about the game.
Well, you've written a lot, Lee, and one of the books that we talked about and interviewed you about was Branch Rickey. And I am looking at the book, Baseball's Endangered Species, which came out last year to a great acclaim. And among the many quotes, talks about Branch Rickey, the greatest scout in baseball history. This is Joe Madden. Is that so?
Well, I'm the greatest, I mean, he's up there. He's up there in the pantheon. And one of the great experiences I had when I did the Ricky book, in fact, this book is an outgrowth of the Ricky book, because my Ricky book was 600 pages. It could have been in 4 digits. But there has to be in the life of any writer a point where it's the research, you got to, pause, you got to sit down and apply the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. But when I finished the Ricky book, I realized there were a lot about the scouts that he was so fond of and hired that I needed to do more on them and also other scouts, and that's how this book developed. And I'll never forget when the Ricky book came out and we sent the copy to Joe Madden. He grew up loving the Cardinals in Pennsylvania, Hazleton, PA, and what he loved too was that quote that Ricky used throughout his life. I mean, he was very successful in the late years in St. Louis and certainly Brooklyn. But early in his career, he wasn't successful managing the Cardinals. And at the end of his 5 years in Pittsburgh, they didn't do very well, although he did set the ground by plucking Clemente from the Dodgers and getting Face, and Bob Friend was already there, but he got Skinner and Mazeroski. So I felt, and he had this quote that Madden was actually quoting back to me about never grow accustomed to the emotions of continuous defeat. And one of my great experiences in doing that book was meeting Joe Madden in the Rays dugout the year after they made the World Series. And we're quoting this together, never grow accustomed to the emotions of continuous defeat, because he had it in St. Louis when he managed in the early 1920s, and he was having it again in Pittsburgh. And it's so, it's not only the essence of Ricky, but it's the essence of what the game is about. It's about losing, but not feeling like you're a loser, and coming back every day, and to know that the sun's not going to shine on everyone's head the day before, but tomorrow is your best friend, especially when the season has a lot of games left. So that's kind of the inspiration for this new book. And I've never been a Yankee fan, but like the biggest chapter in the book talks about why the Yankees were successful, because they had the best scouts.
And one of them was Paul Churchill, wasn't it?
Paul Churchill,
excuse me.
who found Gehrig at Rutgers. It was a day off, and there was no baseball being played in New York in 1921 that particular day. So he takes the train to New Brunswick. It's an hour ride there, and he sees this guy hitting amazing home runs. And he asked the coach of the team, who was actually a major league pitcher of some note, Andy Coakley, and he says, that guy playing outfield that day, who was he? He says, oh, Gehrig. I mean, he's a left-handed pitcher, but we sometimes stick him in the outfield. Well, he takes a note of it, and he goes back to Columbia, near the campus and near where I live today. And he sees him playing against NYU and hits a couple on the library steps, if you know that campus. Within a couple of days, he signed Gehrig. And just because he decided to go to Rutgers because a real scout is always looking for the next game and for the diamond in the rough. And so that's one of the stories in the book. Churchill also signed Leo DeRocher because he thought he was the best shortstop he had ever seen. And DeRocher had been encouraged by Rabbit Moranville. And what he learned from Rabbit, Leo did, is never take a backward step on that diamond. And the great thing about this game, Greg, is that these lessons are applied every day. And this is where baseball is so special to me and should be to the country, because the essence of the game hasn't really changed since the late 19th century, you know. I mean, as Hug McGraw said, the ball is round, the bat is round, and you have to hit it square, you know. And you know, one of my favorite stories when I was doing radio in the 80s in New York, it was still the Soviet Union, and a TASS reporter, Soviet TASS, came to Shea Stadium on what was going to be a World Series winning year for the Mets. And I asked him, do you like baseball? He says, I find it boring, you know. And so I give him the Tug McGraw quote, the ball's round, the bat is round, you have to hit it square. And he laughs, he says, I don't get it.
Hey, you know, it's interesting that part and parcel of the continuum of baseball are the scouts, and that's what the essence of your book is. And you quote Greg Morehart, scout who signed Mike Trout, that expressed the essence of the hunt.
Yes.
The hunt, which is what you talked about on Gary just a few minutes ago. I look for dogs who play checkers. We're looking for the unique. Then you go on to underscore by, eyesight and hearing are two of the most precious senses the Creator has given to human beings. And baseball scouts have learned to sharpen these senses.
It's so true. It is so true. And another scout I quote, who I talked to on the phone, the late Julian Mock, who was a principal. His day job was being a high school principal, which is not a bad job to have if you see aspiring athletes around. And he told me in that phone interview that you know, should a guy go to college or should he sign out of high school? And the essence of scouts is that they really, the best ones, know how to cut to the chase. He would tell a high school player with athletic aspirations, do you want to go to college and play ball? Well, if you do want to do that, go to college. If you want to go to college to play ball, well, then sign with us because we're better teachers. And he's also the same scout who, when he was hiring scouts, had these 4 questions he asked of them. And I extend that to signing players. Do you really love the game? Number 1. Are you willing to work harder than you've ever worked before? Are you willing to learn? Are you going to be so set in your ways that you don't understand what the pitchers are trying to do to you or what the hitters are trying to do to you if you're a pitcher? And the 4th one was, are you willing to laugh every day? And he added one that was sort of that I put in as a 5th question, but it was kind of a reverie he had, is that, will you never forget where you came from? So, I mean, and so that's kind of, I put that at the beginning of the book, and that's why, that was one of the inspirations for the book.
You know, one of the things I like is nostalgia. I mean, baseball is replete with nostalgia, and, you know, always can harken back to the old days. And I really got that sense in reading the beginning of your book, the introduction, where you quoted as saying, I'll quote it, older scouts possess such great wisdom that the missed opportunity of younger players and scouts to learn from them is a tragedy, as your sort of theme of your book is, scouts are, and as it's entitled, baseball's endangered species. And the reason you wrote the book, you state, is to make sure that their voices from past and present will not be wholly lost. I invite you to savor these tales of the great games, and that's your prelude to this. It's sort of like Lawrence Ritter, what he did with the book that became so famous. You're doing this with scouts.
Yeah, the glory of their times.
Yes.
And I have a wonderful Ritter story because I taught his son in Wisconsin in grad school. And I was dutifully giving some of the history about the the election of 1824 in America, and I mean, which we all remember so well. I mean, it's 200 years ago as we're talking. And the candidates were John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and the last candidate was William Crawford from Georgia. And then, of course, as I like to make asides, or in terms of my motto, I digress, therefore I am. I said William Crawford is not related to Wahoo Sam Crawford, who played with Ty Cobb, is in the Hall of Fame, and is featured in a chapter in this wonderful new book, The Glory of Their Times. After class, Steve Ritter comes up to me and says, I worked with my father on that book. You know, I carried the tape recorder around as he went all over the country. And Ritter so I ultimately met Larry, and, you know, the luncheon that was organized around him in the 80s still goes on, you know, and so he became a really dear friend and an inspiration. And he was also, in terms of how baseball, I mean, you don't have to love baseball, but you do have to tip your cap to how it shoots out to so many realms of American life. Ritter was a famous economist at the Stern Business School at NYU, and his Money in Banking textbook is maybe still used to this day, you know, but his life became so much more diverse when he went out to interview these old timers, and the inspiration was a colleague at NYU who said, Ty Cobb just died. I mean, you got to interview these people before they're gone, and so that's how that happened. That's how I met him, and in terms of the great connection through baseball, my last chapter is about the scout Bill Enos from Cohasset, Massachusetts. The first major leaguer from Cohasset is now playing for the Yankees. Ben Rice, who came out of nowhere from catcher, I believe undrafted. And he's kind of saved the Yankees right now. And he went to Dartmouth, and I'm not a Yankee fan, as I said, but boy, is that good for baseball. The chapter ends too with the story of a Yankee scout who was a great softball player, then played hardball overseas, and she's the one, Kelly Rodman, who pushed very hard for Anthony Volpe to be the #1 draft pick, and he's been the Yankee shortstop now for 2 or 3 years. She unfortunately passed away from a brain cancer at the age of 44, but she was scouting almost to the day she died, and that's the passion and that's what I wanted to honor and tell the stories about in the book.
Pause for a second, and we have Randy Anderson. You met, he's the president of Chautauqua Sports Hall of Fame. And one of our local resident natives was a guy named Tommy Leach. Tommy Leach, he was born in French Creek, New York, Chautauqua County. And we made an effort to get him into our local Hall of Fame, which we were successful, because of the tape that we were able to get from the Cooperstown Hall of Fame, which was Larry Ritter's interview with Tommy Leach.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great, and yeah, he's quite a story, Leach. I've been finishing up this week a class on baseball fandom at Chautauqua, one of the almost regular classes I do, and I've been reading this anthology that Jim Riesler put together, Damon Runyon baseball reportage. It's an anthology. There's not too much history in it, but there's talks about Leach. I mean, he knew McGraw. And he knew Stengel. I mean, he's got the chapter in the book of Stengel's home run at Yankee Stadium in the World Series, and you know, where he was running so fast that they almost had to slow him down. And there's the great story in terms of the connections. 30 years later, Mickey Mantle is getting ready to play a World Series game, and Stengel is mentioning that he hit a home run at Yankee Stadium, and Mickey Mantle says, "What? you played here?" You know, and so one of the growths in me, because I mean I love the game more than I love the Orioles. But it's 1 and 2, you know. And I do root against the Yankees, but I do put it's the good head-to-head competition is good, and you really have to tip your cap to what the Yankees were able to do in their heyday. And I did get into the book, the story of how Stengel, one of the reasons he may have gotten that job, and for the unprecedented 5 World Series in a row, he had been unsuccessful as a major league manager in Brooklyn and Boston, but he got better in Oakland, where he had Billy Martin, but he was still known as a losing major league manager. And Del Webb, the co-owner of the Yankees, supposedly was driving Stengel back to the airport after the interview, and Stengel sees kids playing baseball. And he tells the driver, stop. And Stengel runs out to see these kids playing baseball, and he instructs them. And that supposedly, it may be apocryphal, but it is a great story. Webb says, well, if he cares that much about doing this right, well, we're going to hire him. And he was a great teacher. And so I'm glad to honor him in the book, as well as Ricky Scouts and other scouts who they don't get paid much, but they've been the heart and the backbone of the game. And of course, a lot of scouts who get a little cynical, and so they say we're the backbone of the game, but I think we're treated a little lower.
Well, part of your introductory, after your introduction, you get to the chapter on Bertie Tebbetts.
Oh, yeah.
Which is fascinating. He's a lifer, a complete lifer, but also an advocate when he was on the baseball committee for the Hall of Fame as one of the of designating scouts as eligible for the Hall of Fame. Now, it didn't prevail, but talk about that campaign and why you believe that's an important discussion to continue.
Well, Bertie Tebbetts, George Robert Bertie Tebbetts, has been called the Horatio Alger story because he was his father died when he was 3, but he came from a large family on his mother's side, and he all he wanted ever to be was a baseball lifer, but he was a bright enough guy to go to Providence College, and where he graduated with a degree in philosophy, and then he was signed by the Tigers actually before he went to college. Critchell tried to sign him, even visited his house, but the widow Tebbetts said, I want my son to finish college, and this visit was even before high school was complete, and says, so I don't, my boy's going on, no one in my family is ever going to college. And Critchell had signed Gehrig, but the scout who got him for the Tigers, Jean Dubuc, of French-Canadian origin, had signed Hank Greenberg for the Tigers because he said, they've got Gehrig. I mean, you're not going to play first base if you got Gehrig. And the Yankees were on the verge of getting Bill Dickey. The 1927 Yankees, if they had a weakness, they didn't really have a great catcher, and they did at a platoon. So that combination of things led Bertie to be a Tiger, and when he was still in college, he played an exhibition game where he caught Lefty Grove. And to give you an idea of how confident he was at an early age, Grove was the Koufax of his day, and he. Or I probably should say that Koufax was the Lefty Grove of his day. And he was having trouble catching the balls, Tebbetts. And Grove calls him out to the mound and says, what's with it, kid? And he said, you do the pitching, I'll do the catching. And so he goes on, and he arrives in the big leagues, even from the earliest ages as a player, he understands the importance of being a good role model, or communicating well with fans, and even he said that he liked the nickname Birdie because fans can identify, with Birdie or Mickey or Bird later on with Fidrich. And so he goes in the Navy. I'll cut to the chase with this. He's known in New England because he caught 4 years for the Red Sox and was on those heartbreaking lost teams. But he was a friend and teammate of Ted Williams. He tried to encourage Ted to be a little more forthcoming or affable with the press, which was an impossible thing to do. And Williams was Williams, but Tabbits winds up with the Indians behind Jim Heekin. Then he manages the Braves and the Indians, and then the Braves Manager of the Year. Frank Robinson's first manager, and they became lifelong friends. And so but he smoked, and he had a bad heart, and heart attacks ended his career in uniform. But one of the reasons he inspires me is that he's no longer out of uniform as manager when he goes to the new Met organization and starts at class. He starts in the Appalachian League, and for 1 year, and he says, if you want to reach the top, you got to stop at the bottom. And then he becomes a scout, and he's a great storyteller. And when he's on the Veterans Committee, he's always pushing for scouts because, as one of the scouts told me, the one who's Herb Stein, who signed, Rod Carew and Larkin and Frank Viola, he said, "You're nothing really until a scout signs you," and he had that inspiration. The good scouts do. That once you sign a pro contract, the monkey is off your back because somebody has appreciated you, and now it's up to you to answer positively those 4 questions that Julian Mock raised a little later. I mean, are you loving the game? Can you learn? Are you working hard? And you're having fun? And believe me, and this is why the game always enthralls me, and it probably always will. I mean, it's the toughest league in the world, and the pitcher is trying to take money out of the hitter's mouth, the hitter's trying to take money out of the pitcher's mouth, and who's going to win? And the thing we got to be careful about, and I think people in power and baseball are aware of it. I don't know if they'll. You really got to make sure they want to win and are real competitors. And I'm not. I'm in my 80s, so I'm not a super old curmudgeon. But I met Frankie Frisch once, and he was the Gas House Gang captain and then manager. And I remember he being interviewed, and this is the 50s, and he's saying, "What's this with the catchers? The batter's picking up the catcher's mask when he goes for a foul ball." He says, "When we played, I kicked the mask, all the way down the first base line." And so, that's one extreme that's gone. But, I'm a little bit, it's not just the All-Star game, but, the chatter between opponents that we see on TV. A lot of them have the same agents, and so we got to be careful about that, but the scouts, and that's where makeup comes in, and that's kind of the sixth tool. And Branch Rickey was the one who coined the 5 tools, run, throw, field, hit with power. But the 6th tool is makeup, and that's projection, and that's the hardest thing about scouting.
Well, talk about scouts, and one of the guys that was part of our world was Wish Egan. And the Detroit Tigers, that we in their 40s and 50s were affiliated with the Tigers, the Frank Larrys and Frank Bowlings and all of those. And Russ Dietrich, who you probably may or may not have met, but he's still alive. The stadium, he's 90 years old, but he remembers dealing with Wish Egan, and he would bring in, and Hoot Evers would come in, and Pat Mullen, and all of those guys. So when I read this as one of the people who Bertie Tebbets thought should be enshrined, if there was eligibility, it hit home. It personally home.
Oh, I know. Aloysius Egan, and you know, you're carrying the tradition on, Greg, because I saw you talking to the parents of the pitcher who started last night for the Tarp Skunks, and that's what these scouts excelled at. Because this was before the free agent draft that came in 1965 and really turned things upside down. Because in the old days, you had to woo the parents, maybe especially the mother, you know, because and you know, Branch Rickey was very involved with that too, because he knew about homesickness in his own life, you know, and you know, going from really a background where his mother was supportive of his education, but not his father, who said college was for, you know, for rich people. And so you got to know what the makeup is. You got to know, you got to guess what the family dynamics are. And Egan excelled at that. And those people you mentioned, a lot of them became scouts. You know, Hoot Evers, and Johnny Groth. Yeah. And the fellow I did the Imperfect Diamond with, which I brought a copy of the original book, Tony Lupian, who you interviewed here. Mm-hmm. I mean, he told great stories. I mean, he managed and played, or he might have played or managed at Jamestown. And he told you one of the stories on one of your prior YouTubes about the when Frank Bowling came up. He was a major league shortstop, even though he was in Class A. I think he wound up playing more second, and his brother was the shortstop. But the history around here is so rich. And
well, I got to pause. Because you brought up the book, and we'll drop it in the interview. The image of it, the Imperfect Diamond: Story of Baseball's Reserve System and the Men Who Fought to Change It. Sort of a labor law thing, but signed, authored by Lee Lowenfish and Tony Lupian. How did you connect with Tony Lupian?
Well, we're both members of SABR. I joined SABR, Society for American Baseball Research, 1976. 1978, they had a national conference in Paramus, New Jersey, and that's where we met. We were both independently doing books about the reserve labor system in baseball and how it could be leading to a cataclysmic strike. And so we thought that if we could tell this story at a time when there could be a strike, well, it turned out the strike came out the year later, but it's still, the story is evergreen, and it's the reason why baseball labor and there's always a controversy around it. And one of the most connected writers who's on TV now with his bow tie, Ken Rosenthal, talks about there won't be another crisis in baseball for 3 years, but then there will be another one. Well, I don't look at life that way, but if you understand the history of how few cards the players had, in labor terms, it's an important story. And I became an Oriole fan because my first teaching job out of Wisconsin was at Goucher, and then I went back there to teach at UMBC, and Earl Weaver was the rare manager who sided with the players on a lot of the labor issues. And I mean, he would make comments like, you know, if Bowie Kuhn and Lee McPhail would say, well, if we had free agency, franchises would go out of business. Well, it didn't happen, and it's certainly not going to happen today with the value of the franchises through the ceiling. But Weaver would make comments like, well, if they don't know how to run the business, you know, let them go under, because throughout history, franchises, and especially in the minor leagues, have gone under. So this book came out, and I'm in spring training, and I give a copy of this Imperfect Diamond to the press secretary for the Orioles. The next day I come back, and I see Weaver, and I said, "Mr. Weaver, did you see my new book?" And he says, "Oh, you mean Broken Diamond?" Because, I was able, the book's in two expanded paperback editions, but they didn't use the original cover. And even more astounding than that, he had not only read it, but there's Cal Ripken Jr. Senior, his coach, sitting over there. He says, "Can you believe that Connie Mack and Clark Griffith were once in a union?" Because basically the American League was a union of teams that broke the monopoly of the National League. And so, that cemented me as an Oriole fan, despite his, they're not winning all the time, but they were contending. They were playing meaningful games in September, which is like all cliches, there's some truth to it, and that's what you should want for your team, playing meaningful games in September. And if you look at what's happening this year, there's more seemingly competitive teams than in a long time, and that's why I think baseball may be on the upswing a bit.
So tell me a little bit about Tony Lupien, the person.
Oh, he had the greatest voice. He had a deep voice. He came French Canadian. His name was Ulysses, Ulysses John Lupien, but he was signed by the Red Sox out of Harvard. I mean, Harvard has had their share of major leaguers, and he was one of them. And he's working his way up the chain in the Red Sox organization, and they have Italian night in Louisville, and everyone got a nickname. So he got a nickname, Tony, and it stuck, even though he was French Canadian. So he works his way up. It's World War II now. Tony is drafted. And he's at Sampson Naval Base, and like many of the ball players, most of the ball players, they're serving in some physical education unit of the Army. He comes back, and the veterans law has been applied to teams throughout baseball, and throughout all organizations, that if you've been away serving your country, you're entitled to have your job back. Well, he asks for that to be applied with the Phillies, where he's now been traded, and the Phillies says that doesn't apply to baseball, and he thinks about taking a legal case about it. But he doesn't have the money for a big legal case, so he accepts going to the Pacific Coast League, where he's a star in the Pacific Coast League. And I was rereading that chapter that he wrote to the book, which wasn't reissued in the paperback editions. And he talks about how I had forgotten that the picture of Danny Kaye and Jack Benny going to these Pacific Coast League games was very what we could use in the book, because baseball was booming through about 1947, 48. And so he comes back to the minors with the White Sox for a while, and then he starts into college coaching, both baseball and basketball. Goes to Middlebury, where he's the basketball coach. Then he comes to Dartmouth, where he's the assistant to Doggy Julian in basketball and the baseball coach. And he is a tremendously successful baseball coach. The last major leaguer he sent was Jim Beattie, who was with the Yankees and won a game in the World Series. Earlier, he sent Pete Broberg, Chuck Selbach, another pitcher, who just recently passed away, and one other, and he really he made Dartmouth into an Ivy League power, but he was retired early because one of the issues in the 70s was that there was the Dartmouth Indians, and they wanted the Indian removed from the uniform. And I forget exactly what they wanted to put on, but Tony was old school, and he said, "Well, we can't have the old uniform. We're going to have nothing on it, you know." And so that sort of accelerated his departure from Dartmouth, but he really he really exemplified, you know, what old baseball was about, and teaching the fundamentals and doing them day in and day out, and, you know, developing that rhythm that you have to have. I know he's a great admirer of Tom Seaver, and after that first edition came out, I did a pitching book with Tom Seaver, and he had this great line, Seaver, about you've got to find a routine that isn't a routine, and you've got to stick to it. You can't, and all the great ones are like that. I mean, Jim Palmer said that after the World Series was over, the next day he started running 10 miles, you know, because you've got to stay in shape. Now, what's happening today, and this is my cause for concern, that I hope the smart people in baseball are understanding about. I mean, they have these academies now where they're not taking a little time off to let the muscles relax. You know, running is one thing. They don't run anymore. And that, to me, by the way, is, I think, one of the issues with the pitchers. I mean, you know, Tom Seaver made this big point, and, you know, he had the drop and drive delivery, the arm. I mean, look what's involved when you have to go through this, you know, so many times, but you've got to. The lower body is where your strength is. And, you know, in fact, one of the scouts told me that 87% of the game is played below the waist. You know, and so I mean, Lupien was admired Seaver, and Seaver pushed this tremendously too, but I was able to stay in touch with Tony. He died in 2004, and they really sent him out in style at Dartmouth. They had the funeral in the big chapel there, and there was a Dixieland band playing, and he's remembered well up there, and as he should be. And we also bonded because he and Columbia had a big rivalry, but it was a good one. It wasn't mean-spirited, and so Columbia man and Dartmouth man really got together fine.
Well, you know, you've selected your friends well. I mean, you know, think about all that, the people you've met and how many people you've networked. Back to the book Endangered Species, you highlighted a few of the scouts. There must have been a selection process in your mind's eye. I mean, you put a whole list, and these are the guys I'm going to highlight. What was the process? Well,
sooner or later, you got to have a deadline. You know, I mean, I decided that, first of all, Tabbets was the natural way to begin, because he tried unsuccessfully to get scouts into the Hall of Fame, but he made the issue that a lot of scouts made who weren't as well connected. I mean, you don't have anything until a scout says he can play, and they stake their reputation on it. Then, for the rest, I decided to build it as the first half as a little bit of the history between the Rickey teams and the Yankee teams, because, you know, the Cardinals, Rickey's Cardinals were the only team to beat the Yankees in the World Series in the first half of the century, and actually until the Braves, the Milwaukee Braves beat them in '57. But once Critchell was established with Barrow as the general manager, and Rupert wanting to pay whatever was needed. They were the dominant team. But the Rickey Cardinals in 26, with Grover, Cleveland, Alexander, maybe hungover, maybe not, coming out, striking out Lazzeri with the bases loaded. And then in 42, Rickey has now been ousted by in St. Louis by the owner, Sam Braden, who doesn't want to pay him anymore. He thinks he can run the team without Rickey, and he did for a while during the war, but they went downhill without the Rickey farm system juggernaut. But so that team runs the Yankees out of the 42 World Series. And then after that story and how the Yankees survived into the early 60s as a World Series winner, I decided we would divide it into individual scout stories, what I called baseball lifers, baseball monogamists, who have never left any. They've been one team all their lives, and one of them is the scout I've known the longest, Billy Blitzer of the Cubs, and then the other scouts I chose were ones whose stories are not just about their scouting for different teams, but how they wove their findings through the history of the sport. And so again, I didn't want the Rickey book at 600 was long, and my one soundbite that I think explained why it was so long was it was a big book about a big man. And the scouting book could have easily been in 3 or 4 volumes, but it gets overwhelmed. The short answer, Greg, is that it gets overwhelming to think of scouts you're going to leave out, and ideally it would be great to have a staff in different cities giving homage to the Texas Scouts, the West Texas Scouts, the Northern Southern California Scouts, but there was limited resources and limited time, so that's how I chose it, and I dedicated it to both the scout, every scout who looked at a prospect and said what he can do, not what he can't do, and to Kevin Corain, who wrote the book, The Dollar Sign on the Muscle, over 40 years ago. And he was able to travel with the Scouts during the '81 strike. And that's sort of the story of how this happened and how it's organized.
Quickly rifling through the area dealing with the Expos, because we were affiliated with the Expos for how many years, Randy? 19 years?
From the 70s up until early 90s, wasn't
it?
Yeah. Right?
So it's
20 years, maybe?
Yeah, and so you talk about Red Murph, you talk about Mel Didier.
Oh, Didier, yeah.
Excuse me. And most importantly to me, and a good friend at the time, was Gary Hughes.
Oh, Gary Hughes, rest in peace, whose legacy continues with one of his sons was an advanced scout with the Yankees. He may be with someone else yet, and the other one is a clubhouse manager with the Marlins. And Hughes was a great guy to talk to. Because he didn't. The issue here with so many scouts is they don't want to tell stories out of school, the older ones. And so I didn't have a formal interview with Hughes, but he went to the same school that Barry Bonds and Brady went to, the same high school. And he started as a journalist before he became a scout, so he knew how to talk to the press. And one of his great lines was that he signed 2 Hall of Famers, John Elway and John Lynch. But the Hall of Famers in football, not baseball. And one of my favorite trivia questions for the Cooperstown area is what is Don Mattingly, Willie McGee, Bernie Williams, not Posada, but Gary Close, Casey Close, who became Jeter's agent. He went to play at Michigan, and now he's a big agent who's married to Gretchen Carlson, former Miss America, and someone else was and John Elway. What do they all have in common? They played for the Oneonta Yankees, not on the same team, but Elway hit .318 and led the league in RBIs in the New York Penn League because he was using that as a bargaining chip because he didn't want to play for the Baltimore Colts. And if Ernie Accorsi, who was running the Colts at the time, if he had known that Elway and his father, who was his coach at Stanford, had real bitterness toward Frank Kush, who was coaching the Colts at the time, because Kush was coaching Arizona State, and they had real bad blood. And if he had known that, they would have replaced Kush, and Elway would have become a Colt, and they would never have left Baltimore. And such is the fates of history, you know. So it's and there's so many of these things connect in sometimes very surprising ways.
Well, one of the seats you were sitting in last night, front row, reserve grandstand, I told you the story that many moons ago, when we were affiliated with the Braves, Paul Snyder came. Mm-hmm. I knew he was in town, and I knew he'd be kind of batting practice. So like at 4 o'clock, they're doing batting practice, and you'll hear that in the interview, the bats cracking. I said, would you mind talking about you, specifically about his connection to the New York Penn League? Because he played there.
Yeah.
He played there, and to talk a little bit about his job, so that you were sitting last night serendipitously in one of the people you are mentioned in your book, Paul Snyder. Yeah,
that's a special feeling. I mean, Snyder just passed away within the last few months, but I met him. You know, the Hall of Fame 11 years ago had a scouting exhibit, and so that's when I met Scott Snyder for the only time face to face. But there were so many people came there. Mel Didier came there, and they still have the scouting reports that were sent there, but they don't have a permanent exhibit on scouting. They thought they would. But Snyder is an example of maybe the shining example of the baseball monogamist, you know, who played for the Braves. He got to know Roland Heeman, one of the most positive towards scouts GM. And then Jim Fanning, who was in both the Canadian and the American halls of fame. And you know, the Braves way was very special, you know, and that again was based on makeup and based on, you know, you only learn to play the game by playing the game, you know, and that you don't criticize the player until the day after, you know. I mean, even going immediately to the iPad that you see in the dugout nowadays, you know, and I mean, you can really, there's that expression, you know, the acronym TMI, you know, too much information, and that, I mean, you wanna learn, as the scouts said, but there's a time to learn, and there's a time, you know, to trust yourself, both as a pitcher and a hitter, and the Braves were incredibly good about that, and he worked with Bill Lucas. He always gave credit to Bill Lucas, whose story I tell in the book. Bill Lucas was really the first black general manager in baseball, but Ted Turner had come on, and after being a spectacular failure, although drawing fans because he was Ted Turner, he let Snyder and Lucas run that organization. And that's when they began to be good, in the 80s and then especially in the 90s. And Snyder and Bill Lucas was an African American who was a good player, played at Florida A&M, where Andre Dawson later played. And Lucas got injured in one of the minor league games, so he never made the majors, but he knew he wanted to be a baseball lifer, and he came to work for community resources for the Braves in the mid '60s when they had moved from Milwaukee, and then he rose quickly to become a scout, and he and Snyder worked tremendously together. And Snyder saw what Lucas had to go through in the minor leagues, had to live by himself in bad parts of town, but he never let it get to him, and so he was responsible, the two of them, for bringing Dale Murphy, and Murphy, in a very moving story, it's the first time he's ever been on a plane, and he comes into Atlanta, and they meet him at the airport. And so, you know, it's a hard game. What I've learned from the scouts and the coaches I've talked to, the thing you have to understand, this is a hard game. And someone must lose every day, and you have to learn you have to learn from that, and you can't be beaten down by it. But you also have to be humble, you know. And and nowadays, I mean, I don't like to listen to too much talk radio, because, you know, nowadays everyone has a cell phone, and everyone knows everything, even though they're so far away from really what's happening. Another great line that Tony Lupian told me from Jimmy Dykes, who he played with in Hollywood and after World War II, was, the farther away you are from the clubhouse, and I'm sanitizing this a little bit, the farther away you are from the center of your athletic talent, the less you know what you're talking about, you know. And as Joe McIlvaine, another great scout that I talk about in the book, and who, there are only three things you need to know, and, you know, head, but, you know, projecting that is the key, you know, and the great scouts have always been projectors, you know. And like Herb Stein talking about scouting Rod Carew as a teenager, and that his wrists were like a man's already, you know. I mean, he had a man's wrist when he was 17. And then, I mean, I didn't get to know Frank Robinson well. I've been around him. He could be mercurial, but he understood the game. Frank Robinson's one arm was, you know, double or triple the size. And so you have to look at that, you know, and then you have to see, you know, can he play with it? You know, I mean, another great line from the trainers who I did a fitness book with after the Seaver book is that too many guys are all sizzle and not steak. So again, it's up to the scouts and the good coaches to tell you who's developing and who isn't. And it's very difficult work, you know. I mean, who's having a great year but has really hit a ceiling, and who's really on the up, you know. And as an Oriole fan, I hope we'll see Henderson keep going, because he's striking out much too much for my taste. But people don't care about strikeouts anymore, you know. And I think pitchers are probably not helping themselves by going for strikeouts that often, you know. So
in your book, you say, quote, "As am I, like Ricky, I don't belong to an old guard that refuses to re-examine the old shibboleths, but I do firmly believe that it is time for re-examination of Billy Bean's Moneyball and better ball crazes. The pages that follow will present the counter-argument that traditional baseball scouting has much value and should not be discarded. Your premise being it's being discarded on a fast pace, and you want to pause and give a counter. This book is out. It's gotten a lot of positive reviews. Have you gotten feedback as to saying you make a good point?
Well, it's funny, I'm glad you raised the subject, and hasn't gotten as many reviews as I would have liked. And I think part of it is that it takes frontally on the Moneyball and the Better Ball people. I mean, so many of the teams are so reliant now on what the Yankee fellow in charge of the big analytic honcho Fishman says, we're looking for the next best thing. And the next best thing, the modern equipment they have now, they can break down so many things, but again, they're not trusting. You want players to know themselves. So, I really think there is too much information out there, and we're going to see what happens. This so much is dependent on the media and how they play things up, and they play the analytic stuff up now, and the velocity. What broadcast have you seen where you don't say, "Wow, that was 98," or look at that spin rate, So I am concerned. I call it an epidemic of the pitching injuries, and but they don't want to. A lot of organizations don't want to hear it, So.
Well, you go. I guess it's perfect. You quote a couple of scouts. One says, "God gave you 2 ears and 2 eyes and only 1 mouth, so it helps to use sight and sound more than one's own voice."
Yeah.
And then go on to say another memorable old scout saying, "Those who can evaluate. There are those who can evaluate, and then there are those who can't. They measure."
Yeah. Well, I heard it first from Vince Scully, but I think it goes way back about too many analytic people are using statistics like a drunk holds on to a lamppost, for support, not illumination. And I am definitely in that school, but in pure power terms, the analytic people are, and it's very, very interesting too. John Smoltz drones on the Fox game of the week. He's in the World Series, but he gives podcasts, and he really spells out what's wrong right now about what I was mentioning before. The search for maximum velocity and the search for maximum spin rate is ruining a lot of people, and the good organizations are mixing with the guys come back from Korea and Japan. And or helping organizations, move forward. And I'm a great believer too, that you win with a couple of grinders. You can't win with, and when I talk in the Paul Snyder chapter about Mark Lemke, who a very low draft, but he's almost like the Eddie Stanky of today in terms of Branch Rickey said about Stanky is he can't run, he can't hit, can't feel. All he can do is beat you. So, and again, that's where. You're looking for players who have that great desire to win, and it's getting so. Pitchers. If a pitcher goes 6 innings now, and they never expect to go more than 7, and so and a friend of mine who's a scorer now predicts a time when. A win will be given to somebody who goes 4 innings instead of 5. So I don't dwell in that. I mean, as you know, Greg, I sign off my blogs and comments. Stay positive, test negative. I still believe in that. But but one thing, baseball is life, and I love this quote that Tom Hanks gave just before he was in a league of their own, where he said that football is war, basketball is struggle, baseball is life. With all the warts, so.
Well, I'm looking at the book jacket, and on the back of it, just a couple of delightful things, and you should be so proud. Dusty Baker, scouts are like the blues musicians of baseball, whose stories reveal the heart of the game. Lee Lowenfish has dug deeply to bring these tales back to life. But what I found the best, and really is as a compliment, such a compliment to you and your long-standing writing, is Marty Apple. Lee Lowenfish has always been thorough and insightful in his writing, and his latest book is no exception. There may not be any scouts in the Hall of Fame, but being included in this book is an accolade for them as individuals and for their profession.
Well, Marty Appel is in the group that started around Larry Ritter, so it was heartwarming to read those comments.
Well, and I've just enjoyed so much, and I know your time is precious, and I want to make sure you get out of time, but she just entered the room, so your final paragraph is so appropriate given last night. Finally, a warm appreciation goes to Maria Patterson for putting up with the long process this project entailed. Maria, the time for seeing minor league baseball games will arrive real soon, and it happened
last night, which is a Frank Capra film, and it's epitomizes, the history of the sport, especially Meet John Doe, which where Gary Cooper and Walter Brennan are old minor leaguers, and start sort of throwing, having a catch in the beginning of the film. So another reason why baseball so envelops our life in America, and the stories and the dedication is something to succeed, and to just be part of it is that I'd like to keep it alive, and that's what a lot of my life's been about. And
keeping it alive, Maria bought you that wonderful shirt of the Jamestown Tarp Skunks. That will be turned into a baseball card, I'm telling you.
All right. Great being with you here today.
It's outstanding. Thank you so much. I look forward to the next.
Oh, great. Wow. Time flies. Time flies when you're having fun, boy.
It's just great. Thank you.